Thank you everyone for coming. We apologize for the slight delay. We are more than thrilled to have our last day and third of the Paris Conversation program, the panel Pan-Africanism and Contemporary Aesthetics, with an incredible roster of panelists, namely Christelle Oyiri, interdisciplinary artist, Sumayya Vally, architect, principal of Counterspace, and the first curator of the Islamic Art Biennale, Grace Wells-Bonner, founder and artistic director of Wells-Bonner London, and finally, the one and only Cédric Foch, chief curator of CAPC Bordeaux. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Oh, yeah, thank you. We're going to be together for a little bit less than an hour. I'm very, very happy and honored to be in conversation with those three great minds and practitioners. I just wanted to start by saying that the conversation is not going to be focused on the history of Pan-Africanism itself. I don't think none of us would say that we are experts on the topic, but preparing for the conversation, I think I understood why we were put together, you were put together, and I was invited to moderate the conversation. We all belong to the same generation, born around late 80s, early 90s, and I think in the recent years there was an increased interest. That's echo. Yes. Okay, good. In a way, we could reflect on specific histories that had been invisibilized, that had been silenced. And I think that's how we're going to start. I think my first questions to the three of you is going to be how you each relate to history, and not only the Pan-Africanism history, your personal history, how do you include this in your practices, and collective histories as well. And I think that's going to be a great starting point to then delve into some specific projects you've worked on or you are currently working on for the near future. Who wants to start?
Hello.
Yeah.
Hi. Sorry.
This question is very simple. It's about how you relate to history in your practice, whether it is personal history or collective history. And I think for each one of you, it's very relevant in many ways. The other thing I have to say is that each of the wonderful women we have here on the panel are working in different fields. So Christelle is working with music, but she's also working in the visual arts. And one of the projects we're going to talk about is an exhibition that took place in Glasgow this summer. Sumayya is an architect, but also does a lot of other things. And Grace works in fashion, but has also been involved in the visual arts. So I think it's also interesting that you have that connection with the visual arts, with that not being the main focus of your practice initially. So yeah.
Okay. Hi everyone. I think I relate to history because I had to make sense of my own. I think as a Black French person. My dad is from Ivory Coast, my mom is Caribbean. So therefore I needed to make sense of their own Pan-African trajectory, because even their union is kind of Pan-Africanist in a way. So I think I needed to make sense of how they met, and my own familial history was already an effort to get it. So it was an effort to actually make a genealogy, on my mom's side and stuff. So I think it started with that. Sorry, yeah, my voice is pretty. Thank you. But I think I also relate to history because I studied it as well, and I do think that like what I try to do, thank you, with my practice as a visual artist and as a DJ and a musician is to try and to create cartographies. And in France, at school, the curriculum is actually Histoire Géo, which is like history and geography. It's considered to be the same thing in France when you study it and you're a kid. So I think that for me, history was always about cartography, and what I try to do with my art is pretty much that, yeah.
Thank you. Sumayya, maybe next, because looking at, hearing some interviews, I also noticed that you were speaking about you wanting to become an archaeologist when you were a kid, and I think that was like an interesting thing to like learn, knowing that you're now an architect. So,
can you have the first?
Yeah, for sure.
Yes, thank you so much for the question and also the reference. You're right in that I have a very deep interest in history, especially, and I'm just reflecting on what we just heard now about how history is taught. I'm South African, and when I studied in architecture school in South Africa, the way that we were taught history was also, and architectural history in particular, was very specific. It was very slanted towards a Western canon. And I've always believed very much in translating the spirit of place and the spirit of histories that are not told through architecture, through design, through curatorial projects as well. This was not planned, but serendipitously, this first slide that we have in the deck is an image by Harun Ghonsali, who's a South African artist and is participating with this work in the first Islamic Arts Biennale. This work is very interesting in relation to what you described about the ways that we work with history and how it's viewed. Harun conceptualized this work around, so the work is about a man named Imam Abdullah Harun, that Harun is named after, who was an incredible community and religious leader. And a big part of the way that faith-based practices operated in South Africa during the time of apartheid also was very much related to resilience and to community activism and so on, and rooted in Islamic practice as well. There was a lot of overlap with histories around resistance in South Africa. I'm raising this work in relation to the Islamic Arts Biennale, where we're also working to, in the same way that we discussed earlier, reclaim titles like Pan-Africanism when you introduced this panel. That's something that we're working with in this Biennale, that the works that we see are rooted in practice. They're thinking through methodologies around gathering, around spirituality, around forms of culture, and what those give us to think about the future differently, to contribute to how histories are described, to contribute to how the future is then imagined, rather than only thinking about it in a historicized fashion that kind of staticizes tradition. We're thinking about these practices as lived. And I think the ways that relates to histories of Pan-Africanism is also very interesting, because they also offer us ways to think about the future differently. And the methodologies that we learned from Steve Biko, the methodologies that we learned from so many incredible Pan-Africanists also offer us ways to think, of course, about how we chart our methods of practice differently.
I think I wasn't sure if I wanted to study history or art. I remember graduating from secondary school. So I think this idea of history as a way of understanding identity and representation has always been an important entry point for me. And I think that when I think about history, it's also thinking about location and positioning. And when I started Wales Bonner in 2015, it was guided by idea to bring an Afro-Atlantic perspective to European luxury. So very much thinking about the idea of institution and not necessarily being outside of an institution, but being able to bring a different cultural perspective within a landscape. And I think that for me also, when I started the brand, it was very much about bringing forward this very refined or beautiful vision of Black masculinity, which was something I had been exposed to in my life, but I didn't feel was represented within the fashion landscape at that time. So it was very much about bringing forward this ideal, I think. But I think I relate to what you said about, kind of using history to kind of reshape, reimagine the future. I was thinking about the idea of Sankofa as well, and an idea of going back to bring something forward and carry something forward for the future generations. So I feel kind of this responsibility almost to be a kind of custodian of bringing forward certain ideals and ways of imagining the future, and to create new worlds, new possibilities. And for me, that's also how probably I connect to the idea of Pan-Africanism, is connecting to this ideal of reimagining the future, thinking about what you can bring back of that kind of imagining and how that can be a tool for creativity and invention.
Thank you. Great start. I guess following up on that question, there was this idea of doing something with what's there and that has been like silenced and obscured, that you have to go back to then feed the present and the future. But there are also gaps. There are also things that we cannot go back to. And I think in the different methodologies that you employ in your practices, whether it is like mixing, whether it is collages, whether it is scattering architecture, I'm interested to know about, like, to hear you about, like, how do you deal with the gaps, not only what's there, but like with the gaps.
Personally, that's the subject of my first video, my first moving image work, Collective Amnesia, that I directed in 2018 and 2019 as well. I think that we tend to have like to fantasize like a vision of history where everything is all the gaps are completed and filled. And for me, like, directed this video was also about acknowledging the gap and the silences, and not necessarily trying to like rewrite something that actually wasn't true. And it was also about like creating my own methodology of like historicism, and like I think that like history is a lot about like factual like events, and about, especially when you're at school, like that's what you learn from history more than methodology itself. You learn that like this king did that, and you have a lot of time, like you have a hard time like filling the blanks and understanding what is actually at stakes. Like, and I think that for me, directing Collective Amnesia, that was a project that was centered around like Black French youth culture that was absolutely not documented, like a movement that we call Logobi, which is like a movement from the social housing project of France, especially in the Parisian region, and like really like ingrained into Ivorian subculture and Parisian subculture as well. And I couldn't find any archives. The only archives that I could find were on Skyblogs, which is like the equivalent of like Blogspot, but like the hood version of it. And I would like find like 2-3 blogs still, and maybe like a couple of YouTube videos for a movement and a phenomenon that was actually like pretty big and like very interesting, and also like people were creating their own ecosystems. They were doing their own websites. They were having their own dance championships, and we had no archive for that. And so what I did is that I started like thinking about, oh, maybe I should do a documentary, because when you're fascinated with history, sometimes your first reflex is to kind of like go through the documentary or the archivist approach. But it didn't work out because all the people that participated in the movement no longer wanted to talk about it, because their relationship with Africanity and with what Logobi was at the time, which was like a very raw African dance mixed with like electronic music, people were not ready for that yet. It wasn't cool anymore. So the people that participated in this movement like refused to speak to me and stuff, and so I needed to come up with my own, with another method that had nothing to do with the documentary style method. And all of a sudden the subject wasn't Logobi anymore. It was why do people don't want to talk to me? Like, why, like my own cousin don't want to talk about the fact that they were Logobi dancers? Like, why did they like deleted their blogs? Like, it was the actual subject then. And that's, for me, like, that's kind of how I think about history. It's like more so thinking about the blanks and the silences than the history itself, because what you've been taught most of the time is not true. So you have to like look at, like, it's like a picture. You look at, I don't know, a picture, and you look at the negative version of it to actually see the truth. So for me, it's like, as Black folks or like folks of color, like you literally have to like read between each lines, because what has been fed to you is definitely not what it is. So yeah.
I think the archive is also dynamic, and maybe sometimes what we see as gaps in written archives or traditional archives can be found in other forms of archive. For example, in this work by Harun again, the archive exists in the memories of people who were at this funeral procession and this funeral gathering. And what we see here is these hats, all the bodies of the people who attended the funeral. And we hear a poem that's recited by James Matthews and recited also by the man's widow, recounting his life, and that he made a huge contribution to freedom in South Africa. He was, of course, killed by apartheid police. Beyond that archive of memory, there's also the living archive in the impact that he had on his community and the lasting consequences of that. Of the community that he held together through practice. If we go to the next slide, sorry. Irshan Adams, again, an artist from South Africa who's very interested in working with traces and who works with piecing together these tapestries from traces of community archive. And next slide, sorry. Next one. Mubarak Bashishi, who's an artist from Morocco. In this work, he's working with the different colors of earth, and there's a saying in Arabic that says, "Kullukum min Adam wa Adam min Turab." Everyone is from Adam, and Adam is from earth. And here we see that the different colors of earth are also analogous to different skin colors. And I think in all of these forms of practice, in Harun working with ceramics and with forms of oral archive, in Irshan working with textile and tapestry and forms of memory and the body, and Mubarak here working with, again, practices that are made with the hand. These are all forms of archive as well that are passed down from generation to generation and still are held in lived practice in communities. And so I really believe that the archive is a place that is extremely active, extremely generative, and extremely loaded. You mentioned as well the Serpentine Pavilion and the fragments. There's also a logic in thinking about the archive as active. And the fragments for me became really interesting. I don't know if we should go to, just flick through a few, sorry, to find that. All of these works about the archive.
I just want to say that actually, because just to be clear that the biennial hasn't taken place, so it's an exclusive preview that you have now.
Yes, it's opening in January in Jeddah, and I'm very excited, as we mentioned earlier, for this definition of Islamic art and for people to see how we're conceptualizing that. So I hope you all join us. Just on the pavilion, I just maybe will reflect a little bit on that form of practice. This is one of the fragments of the pavilion. So the way that the pavilion was designed, I looked at histories of migrations across London, of course, many of them related to African diasporas, but more broadly, many others, and places that became important for communities to gather and build a sense of home, evolve their senses of identity when they first moved to London. So I worked with, I spent a lot of time in the archive at the Bishopsgate Library, and I worked with posters for events, for example, for the Theatre for Black Women, some of the first mosques, African churches, synagogues, marketplaces where people could find traditional ingredients. And I really started to work with mapping these places out, so physically drawing them into being from information that we could piece together from photographs. Those then became the forms in the pavilion, but as you mentioned, as much as the pavilion was about folding London into the pavilion, it was also about folding the pavilion back out into London and honoring some of these places that became really important to the construction of the pavilion. So we had these fragments placed in community arts institutions in London. This is one of them that we just launched in August at the Notting Hill Carnival with the artist Alvaro Barrington. And these pieces acknowledge and hold histories of gathering in these communities, but they also are diasporic in their logic, in that they were inspired by places from far away. They took root in neighborhoods and in communities in context, and then they also grew and evolved with context. Of course, I collaborated then on the ground with many people in those contexts and in these arts institutions. They had input into the brief. Sometimes they were very involved in different degrees. And so these took on that logic, which I think, I hope, and it's my ambition that it does, but it comes, I think, from thinking about the archive in this way as dynamic, and from thinking also about methods that concepts like Pan-Africanism or what it means to be a diasporic can give us.
Thank you.
When I think about my own research practice that informs, my work at Wells Bonner, but also other curatorial work, there's always, I think that there's a benefit to a spaciousness around the artifacts, and the way that I look at things can be through fragments of literature or memories or sound that's starting to kind of build from these disparate elements that I then will collage together and layer together. So it's about kind of bringing these different fields and ephemera together to create an idea of a world. I think that historical accuracy becomes less important. I think it's I need to allow for a sense of spaciousness around the elements to be able to create something new within that space. So I think it's also having being able to be quite irreverent with time and material, like to be able to be playful. I think that's also a way of kind of escaping certain fixed ideas or fixed kind of historical circumstances I think that, as part of the creative process, a sense of irreverence and overlapping across time frames feels quite important to move things forward, and that feels like the space that I'm interested in creating in. It's kind of intersection between that is the space for reimagining.
You just mentioned your curatorial work, and I don't know if we have pictures of the show at the Serpentine, or we could talk actually about the recent collection as well in Florence. But I'm interested in actually the overlap that you create between fashion and visual arts. That, to me, being like in itself like a diasporic methodology, I would say, and how they inform each other's. I would be interested to hear about this. I don't know if we have.
Sadly, I don't have pictures from the Serpentine exhibition from 2019, but there are some images here from the last show I did in Florence, where I worked with Ghanaian artist Ibrahim Mahama. But I think the grounding point to everything I do is this research practice, and I kind of see that as an artistic and a spiritual practice. And then from that point, I'm interested in the different outcomes from that research. So it could be that it ends up becoming a garment, but it could also be a soundscape, or it could be an environment, it could be experience with movement as well. So I think because the different elements of the research come from literature, sound, movement, photography, then I'm interested in the outcome being able to be singular as well, but also something that overlaps. So often this body of research is something that I can convene around with other collaborators and kind of bring people into the world around that to expand on what that is. And then from that point, there becomes different physical outcomes as well. But I think for me, it's really important to have that collaborative expansion, because I think the whole time is about kind of resisting any sense of fixity. So there needs to be multiple perspectives, multiple viewpoints that can expand and disrupt kind of an idea of what something is. So that's really important part of the practice. But this collection that I presented at the Medici Palazzo last June, Ibrahim was like a very important collaborator. I spent time with him in Ghana, and he, thinking about his work and his work with these jute sacks, exactly, that he collected from collaborators in Ghana and exchanged them for newer sacks. These are kind of remnants of kind of post-independent ambitions, and I think, there was something really important and powerful about his approach of connecting to these political ideals and infrastructure and building, which is now, over time, buildings have, these buildings have been abandoned. He's thinking these spaces and reconnecting to that spirit. So I think for me it was really having this dialogue with Ibrahim really informed the way I was thinking about the collection and thinking about different elements of craft and weaving, and how this sense of physical making becomes really embedded into the garment as well. So I think, even this idea of weaving, whether that's these sacks, but also the fact that they're stitched together by hand, I think you can actually physically embed a history within the garments, or you can even embed a sense of musicality or rhythmicality within the cloth. So I think that's quite powerful, the closeness, I guess the position of a designer, and I think this is why it's interesting to me. You have a very close relationship with the wearer, like it's very kind of an intimate relationship in terms of what you're creating, but also there's something that can be very immediate and very powerful about creating an image. Or I think I understood the power of imagery and wanting to expand and proliferate a very refined image of Black representation.
You started to talk about like collectiveness or creating those moments of gathering, which to me are like one of the things that we can learn and take from the history of Pan-Africanism, actually, in relation to, I mean, quite often when we speak about Pan-Africanism, it's through the lens of the congresses and the festivals that took place in many different places, and that gathered a lot of different people together to exchange, which somehow is like something that's happening right now. And it's the first time you've never been in touch with each other, but you know of each other's work, and I think it's a wonderful testimony of actually like what we can learn from Pan-Africanism itself. And obviously in each of your practices there is this idea of togetherness, because we dress up to present ourselves to other people, we inhabit buildings and places, and we dance together, although we can dance by ourselves as well. And I guess that's something that maybe we could also like linger on, this idea of collectiveness, and how this, I think, is actually like the main point when you approach a project for each one of you. But based on, keeping that in mind, I think one of the very interesting things as well is this idea of universalism. Going back to like a specific manifesto that was published at the occasion of the Pan-African Festival in Algiers in 1969, the wording that was used was very, very, today we would say problematic. in a way it was talking about nationhood, in a way it was talking about this ideal of like the universal man. And so to kind of like think about this idea of collectivity is interesting, I think, in balancing it out to this idea of universalism. And I was wondering how you yourself relate to that. I know it's a complicated question, but I think that's something we talk about, we think about all the time, because we always asked, like as practitioners of color, like who do you want to speak to? Are you speaking to like everyone, or are you speaking to like very specific groups of people? And basically that's kind of how do you relate to that question?
Wow. I think me and you, Cedric, were French. So this is the country that like gave birth to the word universalism. And like for me, it's like a pretty complicated word, because on one hand, I understand that like we need like values that we can all relate to, and like, yes, like the human rights are really like, like universalism is also about like sharing core values and like being able to like relate to them and like really like enforce them as well. And when you think about universalism, most of the time you think about, human rights. But now it's been like kind of a weird word for some reason, because in the French debate, at least, it's been a weird word for a couple decades now, because it also means erasing all types of like particularism. And when you're an African being, you are the product of one of like the most culturally diverse place in the entire world. Because like in Ivory Coast only, people speak more than 400 languages. So it's already like the definition that they gave at the Festival of Algiers was also the result of like them kind of like trying to like find their groove into like their way out of colonization as well, because they had to separate themselves not only from like physical colonization but also from mental colonization. So that's also why like they still use like terms that like are like very I would say terms that are like synonym of like Frenchness, or terms that are synonym of like a kind of like standardization. When I hear universalism, I have a hard time thinking about like something good. And I think it's also because like with universalism, you think about globalism, you think about like stuff that are like collective in a way that they like erase specificities. And for me, I think this past few years has been about like healing, like ideas of like not about collectivity, because I always think that like collectiveness has always had like a beautiful and positive I always have a positive vision of it, and that's why my film is called Collective Amnesia, because I don't think necessarily of me as an individual. Like, I think about me within a group. And I just want to like also think about like just talk about what you said about like what is the audience that we're talking to, like who are we addressing who. And I think that like for me I'm definitely I definitely worked around like Black secrecy as well, because I think that like Collective Amnesia is about like black subculture in France, in a very specific part of Paris, etc. Like, I think for me it was also about like I'm gonna try to do the most specific, to think about like the most specific archive and the most silenced like thing, like in a Western perspective. And like kind of like my first concern was to make it resonate with the people that could relate to it. It was never for it to like be universal. It kind of became universal by accident, because the intention behind it and because the actual subject was actually history and erasure, self-erasure, self-hate, and like colonialism. So people ended up relating to it, but I was doing that for me and my peeps. I was not really doing that like for anyone else. And it's just now that I'm actually like thinking about also like creating ways to enforce Black secrecy. Like, you don't want to give all the tools. You want to keep a little garden for you and your friends. And although I want my work to cross borders and translate and gather different people from all parts of life, I want to manage this Black secrecy. It's very important for me that you don't understand everything, and that's what makes it beautiful. Like, pretty much.
Beautiful answer. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, very, very powerful. I think it's definitely a difficult term, and I think that I guess with the work I do, it's very much about kind of resisting any very fixed sense of what something can be, and it's very much more about thinking, kind of creating space and movement and expansion, possibilities around an idea. So I think there's always this kind of sense of resisting anything being locked down. But I also, there was something I kind of read earlier, which was about African musical symbolism, which is by John Collins. And I think this is a quote that I found interesting. The rhythmic dialogues and swinging space of African music draws everyone in. There is always room for a new rhythm, a new response, a new interpretation. So I think that I guess I'm often thinking about this kind of musical the kind of sense of possibility that comes from musical composition. And I think that for me, this kind of allows that kind of sense of, expansion and, riffing off other elements.
And I guess this idea of complexifying is quite interesting, and I think we were just talking about this earlier as well with Sumayya in relation to how we should not take this idea of Pan-Africanism for just like that whole one thing, but actually like also try to complicate the narratives, and which is something you're doing with the Biennale.
Yeah, so in general, my practice is really interested in hybridity and in cultural hybridity. I'm from Johannesburg, which is a place that is completely hybrid in all its difficult inherited histories, but also all of its incredibly vibrant and rich forms of culture that exist despite and because of the challenges that we have. And I think hybridity is an incredible position of power in how it allows us to resonate and translate across contexts. And for me, a project like the Biennale, for example, also does that. The theme that we have for this Biennale is called Awal Bait, which means first house. And it's at the same time a reflection on this place. So the Biennale takes place in Jeddah, which is the gateway to the holy sites. And it's the kind of central focus of many of our rituals. So there is a point of universality in that, for example, every time when we stand up in prayer, we're facing that direction. We're facing it with millions of other people, billions of people across time who have done so and who will continue to do so until the end of time. So there's very much a focus on that these rituals connect us and bind us and that they're universal. But at the same time, it's also a reflection on the forms of cultural hybridity that this place engendered, because it was a place where many people came together and gathered because of the pilgrimage. Before that, if we think about Mesopotamia, it's the place that we all arguably come from, or one of the many places we all come from, if I can say it like that. And so because of the amounts of movements and because of the migrations that this place has witnessed, it's also become incredibly hybrid in its DNA. And that's visible in language, it's visible in food, it's visible in so many forms of culture, both in this geography and in the geographies that cultures traveled to from here. And that's something, again, I think if we talk about diasporic logics, that I think is very interesting for us to be thinking about and for us to be working with, that perhaps to be Pan-African is to celebrate our geographies, but at the same time to resist them, because we're always migrating through them. If I think about our current city, London, my work as an African being and an African voice in that space, my work at the same time in Jeddah from my place and my perspective also, there's resonance with what we bring to these places because these geographies are complex and incredibly entangled. And I believe that that's a position of power for us to be able to work with.
I think it's time for questions from the floor, and we already have one. It's super short. I want to be speaking more, but yeah.
Hello. It's not really a question, it's an observation. I think I was very surprised about the topic of the conversation, but what I heard confirmed that has nothing to do with Pan-Africanism. You speak about cultural hybridation. Okay, this is much more African multiculturalism than Pan-Africanism. There's no Pan-Africanism in this conversation. I'm sorry, but that's the truth.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. But I think that I try to acknowledge that at the beginning. It's difficult to like...
But what choosing this term?
I think there are ways to reclaim terms. and to make them our own. Any term and any grouping can be problematic or it can be useful. I'm speaking about this in relation to my own cultural makeup because my heritage is Indian. The migration to Africa was, of course, related to partition, for example, and I consider myself to be African because I was born and raised in that geography, as were my parents. But
okay, but what about Pan-Africanism? You know what it means, really?
Yeah, let's talk about it. Like, I mean, I'm down. You're down to talk about it. We can talk about it. Like,
I guess, just sorry to conclude, I'm saying that all of these terms can be viewed as problematic, and they can also be seen as terms that we can claim and make our own, because our heritages are all
No, it's too
complex.
easy. Pan-Africanism means something. Sorry.
The political project that is Pan-Africanism, we all, I mean, and again, we're not experts, but that's something that I think everyone is interested in. But because the practice doesn't manifest in a straightforward way the history of Pan-Africanism, I think that was like, it's a perspective, but you can criticize for sure. That's yeah. Sorry.
I have two questions. I'm sorry, they have nothing to do with Pan-Africanism. But first of all, I want to thank Grace for showing us so much knowledge and putting us on this archival journey. And my first question is, where or who did you show to you Ishmael Reed, and how did you envision him in your clothes?
Thank you. I'm trying to think how I came across Ishmael Reed. I can't remember how I did, but he was quite an important person that I was thinking about with the Serpentine exhibition, like Mumbo Jumbo, his writing where he kind of, I think he's been a kind of important spiritual figure in kind of creating language to think about diasporic identities. And I think for me, he really symbolises the kind of visual idea of the kind of a black intellectual, and so his style. I was thinking a lot about his style and what being an intellectual allows in terms of self-expression and representation. So just kind of the way that he wears clothes and the sense of freedom he has because of that role. So he was just someone that through working on the Serpentine exhibition I came into contact with, and I think that's been quite important for me in my research practice. There'll be people that inspire me, and I was thinking a lot about what Ishmael was writing in the 70s, but then speaking to him about his work, he's very much moved on from certain ideas of that time. And similarly, Ben Okri was another writer that I was thinking about with that exhibition, but having dialogues with them, they both had moved on from certain things that I was fixated on about their work, and they expanded that world for me. So I think that's in some way illustrates the importance of convening with people and having conversations around research and for ideas to become much more rich through that exchange. And Ishmael Reed is also a poet, but also a musician. He's also a pianist, so he ended up playing the piano at my show. So I think it was also this like multidisciplinary way of being as well. It's like I can connect to him as a musician, but he's kind of inspiring in many different ways as well. So I think being able to cross over into different spaces through these kind of exchanges is important as well.
Thanks for the first answer. My second question is, you're really open about showing your inspirations and references. Could you ever imagine to do like an open library for students?
I think for me it's been important to be quite transparent about the references and allow people that are interested to go into that journey, because I think that was also because in fashion, sometimes the way that I saw Black culture references quite kind of in quite a throwaway way that maybe wasn't so transparent. So it was important for me to have those trails to show what what the work's connected to, which is a much wider field of cultural practice that's been developing over a long time in many different fields. The archiving library kind of building is an important project for me that's ongoing, so I'm sure there'll be ways of expanding that in the future.
Thanks for the answers. I don't want to talk too much, but you put me onto Mamba Jumbo, and I wanted to ask if you could maybe sign my copy afterwards.
Definitely, yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, guys. Thank you so much for the just really super generous and inspiring to hear your journeys. And one thing, it's more of a comment than a question, but one thing that I thought about was, what I was curious about was your relationship, each of the four of you, from curating fashion, architecture to music and visual arts, as your relationship to the canon and what you could see a future canon would be. And then second part of that, I thought it would be amazing to see an opera at CAPC Bordeaux with costumes by Grace, stage design by Sumayya, and music by Christelle. So if you've got any thoughts for that, please, So answer either.
I started to think about it. That's also a difficult question, and I think that was one of the things that I was also like thinking about the discussion, that position of refusal or not acknowledging, or how to position yourself in relation to the canon, and in relation to that, how do you create something else? Which is linked to like I think you answered some of that question already. I don't know if we can. I think if anything, no one wants to create a new canon, but open doors.
My practice is centered around canon, so I don't know why we would say that. We should all be a part of the project of creating canon, and in fact, we all are, whether we are. Whether we acknowledge it or not, everything we make in the world makes some contribution. I'm just teasing you.
No, but just the idea of canon is something that's so imposing, and that often goes with the idea of actually erasing something else, to me. Mm-hmm. But that's.
Well, I mean, I think for me that this is personal, but the term counterspace also thought about that deeply. And perhaps sometimes the project of making canon is also about existing as a counter canon or existing alongside canon, not necessarily only erasing.
But I actually, when reading about you, some of your interviews and some of I reflected a lot on this question, and I think it's also in relation to the positionality and like the context where we evolve in, and obviously it means something completely different to do this or to try to do this in France and talk about canons in France and talk about canons in South Africa. It's something completely different, I think.
Yeah, I'm also of the Forless generation. You mentioned that we're all in the same generation, but when I was finishing my studies and started Counterspace, it was at the time when the Rhodes Must Fall, Fees Must Fall movement was just starting in South Africa. And of course, that movement had a huge impact on me, but at the same time, seeing a lack of what our canon could be or what our imagined canon should be at school was hugely impactful for me in starting my practice. And I think without positioning it as activist necessarily. At that time, I really had a desire to be able to create and design from my city and from the voice of that city. And I think now in the other cities that I work in, I see that that's possible from places of difference and voices of difference everywhere, that there's so much that's waiting to be translated into canon and waiting to be translated into methods of thinking and ways of working. So I think it's incredibly important that we have slow spaces to be able to think and create and make projects like pavilions, projects like biennales as well, that allow for space for canon to develop at the same time as we boldly create and make architectures and stage sets where we're having operas and so on. Those things need to be simultaneous because of where we're placed in history, we also have or at least I feel the responsibility of being able to work at the slow pace of creating canon, of being able to think through things with depth of imagination and nuance and the kind of slow pace that requires, and at the same time to boldly be able to make and create in architectural or artist installation space, which is of course much faster.
I think we need to wrap up because there's something else coming up. So thank you so much. Thank you to the creators of the conversation for the invitation as well. Thank you.